Good morning, and once again, welcome. It is Sunday, June the 28th, 2020, and this lesson is being recorded for the sake of those who are unable to attend with us a little later on this morning. So we are continuing to provide this because we have a number of our members who, due to the coronavirus and other concerns, they are unable to assemble with us at this time, and we want you to know that you are in our thoughts and our prayers. And to the best of our ability, we will continue to provide these resources for you during this particular time. Just a couple of quick observations that we do want to make. Uh, we made the decision that we are not going to be assembling on Sunday evenings at the building for a few more weeks because there is a substantial number of concerns expressed by brethren dealing with this. So as of right now, more than likely through or toward the end of July, we will continue with evening services as we have been doing, with the plan to start in early August with both services at the building. We look forward to being together with one another as God intends for us to do, to be an encouragement to one another. Another observation that I do want to make is while I will be here next Sunday for both lessons, following that, Terry and I will be gone for 2 Sundays. We will be going home, Lord willing, to visit with our children and with our parents in the eastern part of the country. And so at that time, I will not be recording these lessons while I am gone. So that is just something to keep into consideration and look for alternatives if you are unable to assemble with the brethren when we do assemble. So with those thoughts out of the way, let's go ahead and get to the lesson that we have at hand. We are continuing our study dealing with the Sermon on the Mount. This is the theme for 2020 and also 2021, where we are going to be dealing with the teachings of Jesus. And we've devoted considerable time to the Sermon on the Mount, which of course was at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, and a very substantial lesson. Thus far in this study, we've gone through the Beatitudes, and then we've talked about example, and then also in the last few lessons that we dealt with, we were talking about the purpose of this lesson, where Jesus said he came to fulfill the law. And then he issues this challenge where he says in verse number 20, I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And we've devoted a little bit of time to talking about that. We've noted the corruption of the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. It was actually a self-righteousness, if you will, and it was also a righteousness that manipulated the law of Moses in many different ways. And of course, Jesus had nothing to do with that. Jesus kept the law perfectly, as we've noted in these particular studies. But he also made the point there that our righteousness needs to exceed that particular type of righteousness. And what Jesus was implying is we need a righteousness that comes from the heart. And to help understand that, in the rest of what we have divided into chapter 5 in the book of Matthew, Jesus gives 6 different examples in the form of you have heard that it was said, but I say to you types of expressions. And dealing with the you have heard that it was said, we talked about this last week. What Jesus likely had in mind was either the oral traditions or how many of the religious leaders had manipulated the law of Moses and changed what it actually taught. And then Jesus comes on and he says, but I say to you, and he actually gets to the heart of various commands in the law and by implication condemnation of those who manipulated and look for loopholes and look for ways out of it, and those who think that as long as they keep the externals, that's all that is expected of them. But I am also convinced that Jesus was looking toward the kingdom that he came to establish, the new kingdom, the kingdom that we are a part of. And many of the qualities that Jesus describes in those characteristics and throughout his teaching would show that. So I see in this expression, but I say to you, the heart of the law and also the coming kingdom. And one reason I would appeal to that with both of these expressions is typically when Jesus quotes directly from the law of Moses, he will say something to the effect of, "It is written." And that is not true with either one of these expressions. So that's the thing that we want to keep in mind as we continue with this particular lesson. Today, we are going to look at the first of those 6 things. And we're going to begin with Matthew chapter 5 and in verse number 21. And I want to go ahead and read this text, and then we're going to have some discussion about that today. So we read here in verse 21 of Matthew 5, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment.' But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment, and whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,' shall be in danger of the council, but whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I say to you, you will by no means get out of there till you have paid the last penny." So in this particular text here, we find that Jesus, as we've already noted here, gives this first, "You have heard that it is said, but I say to you," type of an illustration. And let's look at a little more detail at what Jesus is dealing with this, as he is really saying, for example, this is how your righteousness is greater than what you are observing in the righteousness of these scribes and these Pharisees. So here he talks about murder and he takes it further. And the first point that he makes there is, "You have heard that it is said, 'You shall not murder.' And whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment." And that, of course, is in verse 21. And I'm reading from the New King James, incidentally. And what you find here is clearly Jesus is appealing to that which we fully understand to be a part of the law of Moses and actually the New Testament as well. This is very, very straightforward. As a matter of fact, it was one of the 10 commandments as recorded in Exodus 20, verse 13, Deuteronomy 5:17. King James uses the expression, "You shall not kill." But the actual word for kill there is a word that indicates the idea of murder, which I'm going to talk just a little bit more about in a moment. But understand, under the old law, it was very, very clear that you were not to commit murder. For example, over in Numbers 35, and this is where the children of Israel are still in the wilderness, the law is being established, and the law is being written and recorded. Moses gives these observing thoughts about murder. He makes the point there, Deuteronomy, Numbers 35, beginning in verse number 30. "Whoever kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the testimony of witnesses. But one witness is not sufficient testimony against the person for the death penalty. Moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. And you shall take no ransom from him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the priest. So you shall not pollute the land where you are, for blood defiles the land, and no atonement can be made for the land, for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. Therefore do not defile the land which you inhabit, in the midst of which I dwell, for I the Lord dwell among the children of Israel." So you find in this text God is very straightforward about the idea of not murdering anyone, and actually he calls it a capital offense. And that's really something for us to think about as we look at the term that is used here, "You shall not murder." The idea of murder is that of the deliberate and unwarranted taking of the life of another human being. And I know there's a lot of debate about exactly what constitutes murder and so on, but understand that it's not the same thing as capital punishment. And I know there's a lot of people that don't agree with capital punishment, and to that I say fine. It's not the same thing as engaging in war. And there are those who have a problem with that. And to that I say fine. But that's not our discussion today. One thing I do want to observe here is that this is not talking about capital punishment. And one reason we know that is in that text that I just read from Numbers 35, if one committed murder, they were to be executed. And the reason was because of the sanctity of life. The capital punishment is not something that devalues life. It is actually something that values life by holding those accountable who take the lives of another in a deliberate fashion. And of course, even that text, as we noted, it had safeguards in place, such as there had to be more than one witness as such. So keep that in mind when we talk about what murder is as we are discussing this particular text here. But you go further than that. You ask the question, remember, you have heard that it was said, Jesus was dealing with those who had manipulated what the law actually taught. And I cannot help but wonder how those who were in positions of power might abuse their authority to, for lack of a better term, get away with murder. Perhaps they excused some who were guilty because of favoritism or because they are our friends. Or perhaps they may not commit the murder themselves, but they might hire somebody to murder someone thinking to themselves, well, I'm not guilty of the crime myself. I'm just guilty of other things. Or maybe they would hire false witnesses to bring about the execution of somebody, and as recorded as part of the law. And you know what? That's what they did with Jesus. And you have actually several other examples in the Old Testament, and you can even go into the New Testament. In Acts chapter 7, you'll find that Stephen, the religious leaders, they had hired rogues basically to blaspheme and to lie about what Stephen was preaching so that he could be stoned to death. So you might have that as a possibility. They found times where they justified the murdering of individuals. And you might also have the idea that they reasoned that, you know what, as long as I don't actually take somebody's life, I'm not guilty of this thread of sinful activity. In other words, they could have hatred in their heart for somebody. They could seek to just destroy their lives and to make them miserable. They could slander them. Or maybe they would dream of murdering that individual. And all of those things that say, well, you know what, I haven't actually murdered him, so I must be okay. And a third observation that as I was preparing this lesson that was brought up is maybe they were dismissing the judgment of God. And what I mean by that is, they would say, well, you know, I know that God said I shall not murder, and if something happens to me and I have to pay the penalty before I kill somebody, at least that's not going to affect my eternal standing. It was kind of like this attitude of because I'm a part of the children of Israel, that's an automatic ticket to heaven when this life is over. And of course, that's not what the scriptures teach. And those are some possible ways that maybe they had taken this idea, as Jesus was talking about. You have heard that it was said, you shall not murder. And they had manipulated it in one way or another. But Jesus actually takes it further with this expression, but I say to you. And one other quick observation I want to make before I got ahead of myself there is when you look at this description of murder and how they would manipulate things, I just ask the question, is it any different today? You know, while murder certainly is illegal, is it sanctioned and defended in certain situations? You know, I can't help but think of the millions of babies that have been murdered since Roe versus Wade was legalized in the United States of America, and very often for selfish reasons. You look at that definition of murder, and it very much fits into that category. How many today just act hatefully toward those that they do not like, and they're willing to destroy others by destroying their property, ruining their lives, ruining their families. They slander them. They live with spite and bitterness and just make the lives of those whom they have declared their enemies miserable. And so you have their murder in your heart. And then we have in many instances the total abandonment of accountability to God. Where we're living in a nation that doesn't say that there is a higher power to whom we are accountable. And I'm convinced that many of the problems we deal with are a result of that. So give consideration to those things when you think about this command to not murder. But then we go on from there, and we find the first of these six where Jesus says, "But I say to you." And so he corrects that which they had corrupted by appealing to what was actually intended under the law of Moses, you might say the heart of the law, but also going into the future, into the coming kingdom that is at hand. And basically what Jesus is saying here in verses 22 is, you know what? You live so that you don't even get close to the point of murdering somebody. You don't entertain the attitudes and the actions that could lead to even you conceiving of the idea of murdering somebody. You know, murder is typically a crime of passion. In other words, it is something that is done in the fit of anger with somebody that we're going to talk about in just a moment. And the thing about murder is it's one of those things that when it's committed, it is absolutely irreversible. And it's actually one of these things that is so heinous that most humans are actually incapable of just outright murdering somebody. They have a conscience, and they just know that there's something about life where they should not be doing that. So Jesus says, you know, don't just live your life so you don't even get close to that point. And I think that describes the life of a Christian. We're not to see how close to the line of sin that we can get without crossing over that line. We need to stay as far away from that line as we possibly can. But Jesus gives us a couple of things, a couple of observations in that. You know, I say to you, don't even get angry. That's the point that he makes. I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause, as the New King James says, shall be in danger of judgment. And so the observation that is made there is if you're angry, you could be just as much in danger of the courts as you are if you murdered somebody else. Because things happen when people get angry. Now, one thing we need to understand in this is anger itself is not a sinful emotion. As a matter of fact, it's a good emotion when it is used properly. We quite often read in Scripture about how God is an angry God. He's even described as wrathful in dealing with various individuals. Psalm 7 and verse 11, God is angry with the wicked every day, the psalmist there says. And of course there's Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 and 27, which I actually think is somewhat parallel to what Jesus is saying in the text that we're dealing with. And Paul there in this text says, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil." Paul says, you know what, if you get angry, okay, but don't sin. You take care of it, and don't let it turn into something that is going to be a regrettable action. So Jesus says, do not be angry. And you see, from a good standpoint, anger is one of those things that can actually lead to the resolution of problems when it is properly directed. How often is it when people see injustices and ungodliness, they get angry and they take action? And I want to emphasize something. They take action in a proper and a godly and a loving way, not the hatefulness that we seem to be seeing around us so much today. Anger can lead to the resolution of problems when it is directed properly. But uncontrolled anger can lead to all different kinds of problems, up to and including murder on many instances. And thus, Jesus said that those who are angry, they're guilty of the judgment. And Jesus uses the same word there to describe the judgment of the one that those who were the Pharisees had said, if you commit murder, you're gonna face the judgment. Jesus said there are consequences in the local court if you are angry with your brother without a cause toward that anger. So, the next observation that he makes is to control your tongue. And Jesus gives a couple of examples of that in the second part of this verse where he says, whoever says to his brother Raca shall be in danger of the council, and whoever says you fool shall be in danger of hellfire. Jesus says, don't even use words that provoke anger. Don't use words that cause people to become wrathful and to act in a murderous way, or in ways that could lead to that. I'm reminded of James chapter 3, verses 2 through 12, and we won't read this entire text here, but it is a text that describes the tongue, and it describes just how dangerous the tongue can be. And some of the observations that he makes there is it's a small member, but it can start and burn down an entire forest, and that's something that we're familiar with here in California. He describes it as a poison. Think of being bit by an adder or a poisonous snake or something like that, and the damage that does. Paul says that the tongue can do great, or James says that the tongue can do great danger, and it's difficult to tongue, but he says if you control it, you can control everything in your life. Over in James 1 and in verse 19, James would there say, let everyone be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. And over in Matthew 15, verses 18 through 20, we find here that Jesus talks about motives. He talks about how murder begins with the heart. You think that has something to do with the comparison that Jesus is dealing with? He says, those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. Listen to this. For out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. He goes on and talks about to eat unleavened with unwashed hands doesn't defile a man. So Jesus is, what he's saying here, he says, I want you to control your tongue. And he gives two illustrations of that. He says, he who says to his brother, Raca, and actually what that is an insult. And it's the idea of saying something such as an empty head or maybe an idiot. This could be somebody who out of anger slanders somebody else, sets out to damage their reputation. And Jesus says that this individual, he's in danger of the council. And the word for council that is used there, we would think of it as the higher courts. And the actual word in the Greek language is associated with the idea of that term Sanhedrin, which was what we would actually call the Supreme Court of the Jews. And the point is somebody has done something that has done such damage to them that they're liable. And as a result of it, ruling is rendered against that individual because of what they say. And Jesus says, you know what? You won't murder if you don't get to the point where you're not going around insulting people, calling them empty-headed, or calling them idiots, slandering them and such. The second thing that Jesus says is, he says, don't say, he goes on and he says there, don't call them a fool. Whoever says you fool shall be in danger of hellfire. Now, the idea of the word fool as it is used here is to declare one worthless. And we need to understand that there are times where it's warranted to call somebody foolishness or to call out their foolish behavior and maybe even call them a fool because of what they are doing. But we need to be very careful when it comes to that, because the point that you're doing in that, and the point that Jesus is making here is, here's some individual who looks down upon other people as worthless. He has declared that they are morally corrupt and they're unworthy of anything. And I can think of multitudes of examples of this. In Luke 18, where you read about the Pharisee that goes to the temple to pray along with the tax collector, and the Pharisee says within himself, and he brags about how wonderful it is and how I'm not like this tax collector. He's really saying there, I'm not like this fool. I'm not like this worthless person, and I thank you I'm not like that. And he's prejudiced. He's passing judgment on that particular individual. When Jesus would go to the house of Zacchaeus, a tax collector, or Jesus would go and associate with those whom they declared to be sinners and of ill repute, and they would pass judgment on Jesus. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, the fact is they're passing judgment. And oftentimes they're passing judgment in anger on an individual. So they're murdering them in their heart. They're declaring that they are worthless and I want nothing to do with them. I'm not going to try to salvage them because I've declared them worthless. And you ask, can this type of an attitude lead to murder? Think about Jesus. Did they not declare him worthless and morally corrupt in the way that they treated him at the trial and manipulated things to see that Jesus was put to death? But here's the point of this. Judgment actually belongs to God. Over in Romans chapter 12 and in verse number 19 here, as Paul is talking about how we are to strive to live peaceably with all men, among the observations that he makes there is, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And the point that Paul is making there, you know what? Let God be the judge. When you see ungodliness around you, and this isn't saying that there's not a time to step up and try to stop things, but the point is you let God be the ultimate judge before you go around name calling and doing things like that. You could go over to Psalm 94 and in verse number 1 where you read there, O Lord God, to whom vengeance belongs. O God, to whom vengeance belongs, shine forth. So there you have the idea of God is the one who will take care of these things. And why is that? Because God knows the hearts. Remember, that's what we're talking about in these contrasts that are being made here. Jesus is talking about how they've manipulated and twisted the law of Moses to their benefit. And Jesus says, but I say to you, you need to go back to what God intended in the law. And furthermore, the heart is something that is always important to me, no matter what law you are under. So that's what we are dealing with in this particular text here. And furthermore, as you give consideration to this, Jesus gives another interesting warning where he says there that whoever says you fool will be in danger of hellfire. What's the point there? Well, the point is this is eternal condemnation. This is one who is standing in judgment before God and is condemned by God because of his hateful, because of his ungodly, because of his murderous and slanderous attitude with which he seeks to destroy other people. This is one who judges in God's place in anger. And incidentally, the word for hell that is used here is the word Gehenna, which this is the first time we find it used in the Gospel of Matthew, and actually the earliest time, even when you put all the Gospels together. And 11 of 12 times that the word is used in the New Testament, Jesus used it. And he was talking about a terrible place that anybody in Jerusalem would have known of, that they wanted nothing to do with that place. And Jesus was using that as a description of how terrible hell is actually going to be. So that's the point that he made there, is you go around and you say these things, God's going to condemn you, not only a murder, but also malicious hatred, malicious talk, and anger. But then Jesus goes on and he gives a little bit of resolution in this particular text. He talks about seeking reconciliation, and that's what you find beginning in verse 23, where he says, therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Jesus is saying here, I want you to take steps to prevent ungodly things from happening. And he gives a couple of illustrations of how this will take place. The first thing he talks about there is he says, if your brother has something against you, and I want you to know that what he's saying here is you need to take care of it. If you're going to worship God, and bear in mind that Jesus is probably talking about going to offer sacrifices at the temple, and Jesus makes the observation when you get there, you realize, you know what, I've done something against my brother, and he has a fault with me. Jesus is basically saying you need to take care of that. And before you think about coming and offering sacrifices to God, thinking that God is going to accept you with that type of an attitude, you need to think again. So if your brother has something against you, you go reconcile whatever that is with your brother before it is too late. So you find in this text, you've done something. You have sinned. There's another text I want us to just briefly look at here over in Matthew 18 and in verse number 15. And what we find in this text, and this is often a passage we use to describe the process that leads to discipline. And I'll tell you right now, in many instances, it's very, very applicable where that is concerned. And the point that Jesus makes in Matthew 18 and in verse 15, he says here, if I can get my page turned, he says, moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. And I know some versions actually just say, if your brother sins, go and tell him his fault. But here you have the idea, and this is the point I want us to understand here. In our text, Jesus saying, your brother has something against you. In Matthew 18, he says, in Matthew 18 and 15, your brother has sinned against you. In Matthew 5, you have sinned against your brother. I just want to make sure I said that correctly there. That covers both sides of the situation. And what do? Either way, you take care of it. Don't leave it for the other person to take care of. Why? Well, because that's all that you can control. If you're going to be a godly person and your heart is where it ought to be, you do everything you can to prevent the problems. You are to be the peacemaker, as you read in Matthew 5 and in verse number 1 or 9 in the midst of the Beatitude. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Or over in Romans 12 and in verse number 18 that we alluded to just a few moments ago, where Paul is making the observation, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, be at peace with your neighbors. Live peaceably with all men. You can't control what that other person does, but you can control what you do. And often when you control what you do, it resolves the situation. And then, and why is that the case? It's because those that come to God to worship Him, He wants them to do so with a pure heart. He doesn't want us to come to Him hypocritically. He doesn't want us to come to Him with corruption in our lives. It is those who are of the pure heart that will see God, Matthew 5 and in verse number 8, or over in Psalm 24 and verse 4, those that will be able to come into His presence or dwell in His presence, those who have clean hands and a pure heart. I'm reminded of what John said over in 1 John 4 and beginning in verse number 20. 1 John 4 and beginning in verse number 20. And what we read in this text is, if someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God must love his brother also. If you want God to accept your gift, you need to take care of whatever is in error. And if your brother has something against you, or even if you have something against your brother, take care of it. You do what you can to resolve the situation before they blow up and reach that point of where we began our study here this morning. But then Jesus also makes another observation in the last two verses of this section, where He says, you agree with your adversary quickly, while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I say to you, you will by no means get out of there till you have paid the last penny. And this is descriptive of something that was a part of the Roman Empire, is what they called debtors' prison. If you were in debt and you didn't pay your debts, you could be thrown into prison. And if you think about that, you were there till you paid off the debt. But how could you pay off the debt? Because you were in prison. So there was a cruelty that was associated with it. But Jesus is using this as a warning. And if you think about it, he's saying if you got a problem with a brother or your brother has a problem with you, take care of it and take care of it now. You work out your differences before they get out of control. You negotiate with them while you're able to curtail the damage. That's better than the final judgment being passed against you. And I think of civil court, where people will often engage in lawsuits against other individuals, and there may be a case that is pretty clear cut, and you know that you're guilty, and your lawyer is going to advise you settle that case before you get to court. If you push this till you get to court, there's a good chance that you're going to lose, and if you lose, you're going to regret it, and you're going to get the full extent of the law thrown at you. Whereas if you would settle it, you might be able to settle it for a whole lot less, and it will be more manageable. And that's kind of the point that Jesus is making as he wraps up this section. You take care of whatever it is associated with your attitudes of anger and hatred and bitterness before it leads to something that's unstoppable, like murdering somebody, an irreversible action. So that's the observation that Jesus makes there. Now, as we wrap this lesson up with concluding thoughts, understand that we have to control our anger and we have to control our emotions. And when we fail to do so, we lose control of what is going to happen. So what you need to do is you need to take measures to ensure that you do not even get close to actions that you will regret in this life and maybe even eternally. And that brings me to one final quick observation that I want to ask. And that is God your adversary? We've just talked about if you've got an enemy, you work things out with the enemy before the judgment is passed. Friends, if you are at enmity with God, if you are not right with God, God is your adversary, or you are the adversary of God. You better take care of those things, and you better take care of it now. And that's why at the conclusion of every service, we offer an invitation. Maybe there is somebody here who is in need of in some way becoming a child of God because they have sinned and they're at enmity with God and they haven't taken care of their sins. Can we help you with that? We stand ready. Or if as a child of God you've once again rebelled against God, you take care of it and you do what God says in his word to take care of that before it is too late. Do not let God be your adversary. And with that, I conclude this lesson. I encourage you to think about it. If you would at this time, please pray with me. Our dear God and our Heavenly Father, once again we come to you. We are so thankful that you are a loving and a merciful God. And we are thankful that you have given us a law that is not just commands, but it's also a law of the heart. It's a law that will make us a better people. It will draw us closer to you, and it will resolve so many conflicts. And dear God, we are living in a time that is filled with conflicts, and we pray that more and more people will turn to you and your word and use that which you teach in your word to resolve their differences, and help us in whatever way we can to help them to resolve those things. In the meantime, dear God, go with us through this day and until we meet again. We ask all these things through your Son's name, and amen. And once again, I want to thank each and every one of you for listening to this lesson this morning, and Lord willing, in the near future, we will be together again. Come back this evening when we are going to talk about some lessons that we learned from Jericho. And until then, have a good day.